Okay, hi. Well, welcome to the virtual author chat today with Bijal Shah, who I'm delighted is here with us. I met her in a book proposal group, actually, and her proposal got her a publisher, and she's going to be talking about that book. The book I was proposing has changed a million times, and I'm still in the middle of it, as some of you all know. But I'm going to read you Bijal's actual bio so you can be suitably impressed. Bijal Shah is a bibliotherapist, counselor, and author. She is the founder of Book Therapy, which offers individual, couples, and group bibliotherapy, literary curation, and personalized reading services, as well as bibliotherapy training. Bijal's book recommendations have featured in The Guardian, Marie Claire, NBC News, Asian Voice, and various other publications. She's a member of the International Federation of Library Associations and the American Library Association. She is also the author of the nonfiction books The Happiness Mindset, published in 2014, and Bibliotherapy, The Healing Power of Reading, which is due to be published in February 2024, which is what we're going to be talking about. Bijal has also completed a postgraduate diploma in counseling, in addition to a postgraduate professional accountancy qualification and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from the University of Warwick. Is it Warwick or Warwick?
Warwick,
I've just totally lost my British pronunciation abilities. Okay, she previously worked in investment banking at Deutsche Bank and Barclays Capital. She's a mother of two and currently resides in Hampstead, London, with her husband. And Hampstead is amazing, in case no one knows that. All right.
Very literary, actually.
Okay, so what we wanted to start with is the basic and most important question for people who don't know is, what is bibliotherapy?
Yeah, so bibliotherapy, thank you for the question, Julia, and obviously the elephant in the room, really. Bibliotherapy is the use of literature as a therapeutic tool, and essentially using literature as a prompt, as a guide, as a tool for journaling, and other bibliotherapy techniques in a counseling or therapy session. And sometimes when clients don't always want a counseling session, I do also curate reading lists, but essentially it's the use of literature as a prompt for discussion and for reflection in our counseling sessions. And we use a whole host of creative bibliotherapy techniques, from poetry writing to letter writing, to narrative therapy, to reflective practice, all of which I talk about at great lengths in the book, and also give you a lot of case studies as to how this actually works in practice.
That's great. Yeah. And obviously the follow-up question to that is, how did you discover it? I mean, you were an accountant, I guess, or you're working at Deutsche Bank, and how on earth do you go from that to becoming a bibliotherapist? How did you find it? What happened there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, when I was working in banking, I'd always kind of missed the side of being able to work with people one-to-one and sort of just help people, from a sort of psychology. And I'd always had a real passion for psychology. And I sort of, took a sabbatical and sort of decided to do this diploma in counseling, and absolutely loved it. Didn't leave straight away after having done it, kind of carried on in banking, but I felt like when my husband and we lived in California briefly, and when we moved there, it felt like the right time to sort of set this up. And I had to have a lot of therapy sessions as part of my own practice, as part of my own training. And during those therapy sessions, I used literature extensively. I use a lot of the techniques that I talk about in the book, but I found it so beneficial that I really wanted to share that with the world, really. And a lot of these techniques and practices were either based on academic research studies that had been done at universities previously, that had been quite effective, or sort of just delving into a bit of a history of bibliotherapy, which I also talk about in the book. It's been around for millennia, really, but in the 1950s, a lady called Caroline Schroeds did an her dissertation was, I felt, was the foundation of bibliotherapy, and how she kind of draws parallels from traditional therapy to bibliotherapy and the use of books, and essentially the identification that we feel with characters in the text, and then that gives way to allowing us to relieve our feelings and a sense of catharsis through emotional expression, and then the insight that follows as a result of that. And whilst I always advocate using a therapist or a counselor, a lot of the techniques that I suggest, such as journaling, creative, narrative therapy, all of that can be done at home as well as a self-help tool without always needing to see someone. So I kind of wanted it to be quite practical as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I think like that we, those of us who read a lot have probably done, I mean, not exactly what you're doing because it's very specific, and I'm going to talk about why people should read your book, which of course we'll ask them. But I just want to say that what strikes me about it is so exciting is that there are ways in which, when you look at something indirectly, right, as opposed to like, I'm going to look at my life and figure out me, when you're looking at somebody else's experience, either through fiction or nonfiction or what have you, or theater, or any number of ways, like there's a way that it can reflect back that can be incredibly nourishing. And that's why I was attracted to this idea the second you started talking about it in our little proposal group, because it feels so much like my experience. Like at times I've been in therapy, times I wasn't in therapy, or like I remember finding The Golden Notebook, one of my favorite Doris Lessing books ever, on a shelf somewhere randomly when I was 22. And I swear to you, it saved my life. And that's like, I wasn't anywhere near a therapist. I probably should have been, but I wasn't. But that book did a grounding thing, speaking of Hampstead, she lived there, by the way. So Bijal lives
phenomenal
where.
writer as well.
Yeah. And like, and it was just that sense of like, oh, there's a voice I relate to, and there's this person writing about this stuff that I've experienced but haven't quite been able to articulate, and here she is. And so those kind of experiences for me have been life-saving numerous times. So
I mean, there's such an interesting well, there's a couple of things that you said there that I want to pick up on. Firstly, there's a real sense of safety with literature, because you can start addressing the same emotional dilemmas that you're feeling through the eyes of, through the character. So that distance gives safety, being able to look at that problem from that other perspective. And you feel less judged as well when bringing that to the therapist, which is for a lot of people that can be a big barrier. So it's definitely an easier way into therapy versus sort of direct intervention. And secondly, when we read fiction, the brain does not distinguish between us actually feeling that experience as though it's really happening versus reading that same experience in a book. Like, there's no distinction, and there are a lot of research studies to support that. And that's why when we are reading a book versus even watching something on TV, there's more of an effect, because we really feel like we're immersed in that world, and the brain reacts identically. So it's hugely, it's doing something, it's processing, it's allowing us to process things in our mind.
That's so fascinating.
Pathways.
That's amazing. So I'm going to let that lead us right into the next question about why, tell us about your book and what it's about and why people should read it. Just so I think put those together, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for the question. No, so bibliotherapy, the healing power of reading, the name of the book, is essentially divided into 3 sections. The first section is really a history of bibliotherapy, so spanning back to the ancient Greeks and Stoicism, and a lot of Aristoteles's work, and the Greek tragedies. They were literally there to relieve tension and suffering and pain, and the catharsis. There's a lot of catharsis upon reading a lot of those tragedies. So we delve back into that history of therapeutic reading from Stoicism, and then we move on to Michel de Montaigne and his essays, which is essentially the first form of reflective writing and therapeutic writing seen in literature, in the history of literature. His essays, literally, they inspire the genre, I think, of essays and self-reflection and on all of that. And then I talk about Eliot and Wordsworth. A lot of Eliot, we call Eliot sort of like a proto-psychologist, and I want to mention the work of Dr. Kelda Green, because she was the one who, my ideas really follow hers. She was the one in her dissertation who kind of pulled together this whole history of therapeutic reading. And she even suggests in her work that, Eliot inspired Freud, a lot of Freud's theories about childhood psychology. Anyway, so I talk about, as in, everything developing stems from our childhood. And so I talk about that history in the book, and then, go to sort of more modern day versions. Bibliotherapy was, used significantly in both world wars, as was poetry therapy, I guess. And there are a lot of pioneers, both in the US and the UK, of bibliotherapy, and you'd find war hospitals would always have a library attached to it. And then since then, there's been a lot of academic research in the power of reading and what it does to us emotionally and the brain pathways, and looking at the brains under MRI scans after we read something. So there's a lot of studies. I covered some of those in the book, but it's never really been translated into mainstream media, or not mainstream media, but mainstream culture. And that's what my book is trying to do. It's really trying to sort of provide this story of how it's all kind of come together. And then, then I sort of, in the middle section, talk about the more practical aspects, like how can we actually use this? Because that's what people really want to know, is how can we actually use some of these techniques? And I do that through about 8 or 9 client stories. So it's a little bit memoir-y. I talk about my own journey, and I talk about the books that have helped me, and the techniques that I use. So like I mentioned, some of them, reflective practice and journaling, but I use a lot of poetry, both reading and writing poetry. And we talk about narrative therapy and a few other techniques that I go on in the book, but we look at couples therapy and group bibliotherapy, and they all have their power. Group bibliotherapy is just fantastic. It's probably my favorite form of working with books and people, and the connection that's really felt.
How does that work as a group? Can you give us a sense of how that works?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I have a whole example of one in the book, but of group bibliotherapy. But I work with very small groups, 4 or 5 people. We look at a poem together, like if it's on loss, for example, we'll read some poetry with themes of loss. And then there'll be discussion and what the poetry is prompting for people. Other times you may use passages from books. It won't be the whole book because of this fact that it's group bibliotherapy, and we want literature to prompt discussion. So it has to be something quite immediate. So yeah, and then people can go away and journal their thoughts and bring them back the following week, and we'll again go through that and have that discussion, and so there's a real connection between members of the group, because there's a common loss or pain or suffering that they've been through, which can be very, very healing, but there's also connection with the text and the author, and that also is very relieving from an emotional perspective. So that's why I find that it's quite profoundly touching and relieving. So I do advocate it more than some of the other therapies, some of the other settings like individual or couples. But I work, with all of them because they all have their place. Not everyone wants to do group bibliotherapy and share their thoughts with others.
I can see how that would work so well. I'm in a tiny little group. It's not bibliotherapy per se, but it's a bunch of us who have also been diagnosed autistic late in life. And there's a great book by a guy named Kieran Rose, who's also British, that just came out by him and Amy Pearson about autistic masking. And we're reading it like glacially slowly and then talking to each other about it. And so like any word or sentence, will like stimulate endless conversation. And I'm just finding it extraordinary to do. Like it's like a whole other level of reading and a whole other level. And anyway, it's not precisely the same thing, but I can kind of get what you're saying from that. And I'm sure guided in that way you do it is probably even more,
It's the multiple perspectives, Julia, like you said, that really can bring different ways of looking at the same problem, versus a one-on-one where you'll miss out on these other ways of looking at things, and there is no right.
Yeah, and we're used to, as a group, we're used to talking about other parts of just our lives, and which is great, but then to have this text to go to, there's just something about that indirection of going to text that then somehow, it's like that wonderful line from Emily Dickinson about tell the truth but tell it slant. It's like maybe it feels like hear the truth but hear it slant. It's kind of it's like you're hearing it and seeing it, and then it just gains all of this, right, all of this resonance somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shifts things, it's a new way of looking at something, but it's also feeling things that other people are feeling that you are struggling to feel because you blocked it, and somebody's pointing that out to you now.
Yes.
Or I can feel your anger, but why are you not feeling angry? And it's because I blocked that anger.
Good point. Yeah.
So it's really sort of also bringing self-awareness for others, so I talk about some of that in the book in terms of the group dynamics that are going on, the projection, there's transference, there's all of that going on. We're angry at certain group members. Why?
Right.
Right. Is it reminding us of somebody in the past?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that you can work with in a group that might be missing in individual therapy. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's so exciting. And I know I feel like you've already answered this question, but in case you want to, amplify, like, what do you think people would gain specifically, let's say the people here, when it comes out? By the way, if you're in the States, it's a few more months, but by reading the book, like, what do you think? I kind of think you've almost answered that, but if you want to add something, please do.
Yes. Yeah, no, I forgot to add that in the last section, we've got all the reading lists by different mental health themes. So, whether that's anxiety or depression or imposter syndrome or menopause or stress. So there's tons of reading lists for fiction, non-fiction, or poetry, because the way I don't suggest some dry self-help. It's very much, what do you connect with? So if you're a fan of like high fantasy fiction or something speculative fiction, then I will suggest books for you that fall within those genres, because the connection part is the key part of of the therapy. Sorry, excuse me. So that connection piece is very important, and so I have to tailor the suggested books very much. Sorry, I don't know where my voice is going hoarse, but
I know you've been having to talk a lot, so I'll try to take some of the burden off you in a minute, but for right now.
No, apologies. So I really tailor the books that I suggest to what you're going to connect with. So if you tell me I only like to read fiction, I would only suggest books that are fiction, or that are, I don't know, memoirs, for example, if you like memoirs, then I'll suggest books that are memoirs. That connection piece is really important, because if you don't connect to the book, we're not going to get through to the therapeutic process. So the 4 steps really are connection, identification, catharsis, and insight. And those are like, the 4 steps of the framework that I use. So I talk about that in the book, but
and really meeting people where they are, it sounds like, which is really important.
yes, yeah, exactly. And some of the themes that I'll cover in the book, some of them are on like motherhood, but also on sexuality, on loss, as you're very well versed in. Relationships. There's a couple that I've seen, and we talk about how they rekindle the romance in their relationship through literature. And I also talk a little bit about neurodiversity as well, about this boy with dyslexia, and how we use literature to help him. So yeah, there's a variety of themes that I've addressed in the book, I guess, which I hope people find useful. But that last chapter might be interesting, the reading lists, and also the curation aspect, because like I mentioned, I curate a lot of literature, and I sort of set out my methodology of how I actually go about curating literature and the selection process, which I've briefly touched on here as well. So yeah, those are the kind of like the 3 sections: the history, the client stories, and then the selection process and the reading lists.
That's great. Yeah. And then I'm gonna just now like be selfish a bit and say, or just tell people, one of the things that was really moving to me when the Mortality Shot came out, that I'm going to read a little bit from in a minute, a part that Bijal particularly liked, is you ended up putting it in your prescription list on your blog anyway, under bereavement. And I was like, whoa, and so I'm just curious, what about it, made you think this was something that worth doing, like worth putting in there?
Yeah, no, I mean, what I loved about the Mortality Shot is, the angles through which you cover grief. There's a variety of stories in there and essays, which I felt, I'll tell you my favorite one, which was, an ode to irresponsibility, which I thought was very profound. And I'll go into that in a second. But I found that, you were talking about loss from such an authentic place, and having suffered through quite a few losses, I just felt like the writing was very resonant. And when you talked about your grandmother passing, and your need to write a poem about it, it just struck a chord with me, because I'd done exactly the same when my grandmother passed away. I wrote a poem as well, which is actually in my book. But so I just thought that was bizarre that you'd done that as well. But I think it just goes to show that we all grieve in very similar ways, and it's such a common denominator, loss, because we all face it at some point. And I just love how open you are about how you're feeling, and I felt like it was a cathartic read, and I felt that other people reading it would hopefully find that as well. And with loss, I like the fact that your book's got, it's like a short story collection, but it's a short essay collection and a stage text and memoir, and I felt like people could pick it up and read it and then come back to it later. So it was giving them these little snippets of being able to immerse themselves into a little bit of, I guess, grief therapy, without having to get to the end of a book, or and I thought that was something that my clients would probably appreciate, especially like as I mentioned in the more sort of group bibliotherapy aspects. And yeah, I just love the way you talk about mortality, really. And I think you might want to read, I don't know if you want to read from an ode to irresponsibility, one of your essays, but what I really loved about that essay and was how it's only when we know we're going, somebody is going to die, that we give ourselves the permission to be irresponsible and give all of ourselves to them, or just allow ourselves to just, immerse ourselves in feeling free and dropping everything else, and not, dropping all those schedules and commitments and everything that we've signed up to, because in this moment, what I really need is just to be free. And I think that's quite a profound insight. I don't think many of us appreciate that when we have death hanging on our shoulders, we actually have that permission to just be free. And it just puts everything into perspective. I like the meaning that you gave it. So yeah, that was probably one of my favorite essays in the collection. And I think you should read it.
Okay, I will. I asked her what I should read. So this one is an essay, and just to clarify, anyone who's read it already knows this, but it's a mix of essays and some actual fictional short stories that definitely take from my life, but are technically fiction, and this essay. So this is called An Ode to Irresponsibility. And I'll read it. And this was actually published originally in Prairie Schooner, which is interesting if you're a writer, because this got rejected from much lesser publications with unceremoniously many times, and then this very prestigious publication decided to publish it. So you never know. All right, An Ode to Irresponsibility. On an island in Scotland where you go to fall ever more deeply into yourself, a place where distractions fall away like so much confetti, and after some days you finally happen upon that elusive, on the verge of extinction creature, yourself, you are contemplating why you cannot think of a word for the quality of presence of sitting next to someone when you both know they are dying, but whose dying is not imminent. It isn't mortality because you aren't the one dying. There are words such as holding vigil or accompanying for sitting with someone in their last days or hours, but nothing you could find for the more liminal space of sitting with someone over the course of weeks, months, or even years between their diagnosis and their last days. You have communicated with others who've experienced this, and none of them have a name for it either. While there may very well be a word for this in another language or culture, though you could not find one, perhaps because diagnostic technology makes this a relatively modern phenomenon. You wonder if you couldn't find such a word, in part because in your world that is obsessed with productivity, it seems there is little acknowledgement of the need someone might feel to share with a beloved the undefined and unpredictable time and space between life and news of impending death. So you begin to consider the word for being totally present while sitting near someone who is dying is in fact irresponsibility, because mortality calls on you to do what you need to do in that moment, whatever it is, regardless of external responsibilities. And if you think about it, the only time you don't care about all those things is either when you're engaged in a creative project or someone is dying. When your childhood and young adult mentor and best friend and person who helped raise you, for which there is no name because he was your third father's best friend in college and they were both gay but not partners, and so what is that? But he was your chief witness and protector during times of many troubles, and when he died far too early at 51, quickly, frighteningly quickly, of pancreatic cancer, you were so glad you had let go of your theater company a couple months earlier. So you could be there for him. If you had been responsible, you would have not been present, but instead you were. What Walter saw when you were growing up as a young child who had to make her own breakfast because her parents were still asleep, generally hungover, except when he was visiting, and you would have English muffins together, and get herself to school, who was dumped in a dangerous place with a woman who had a psychotic break and almost killed her, followed by her custody being thrown to her unwilling father like a hot potato, who moved to California without her and dumped her at his parents' house on their fold-out sofa for 2 years because he, quote, couldn't deal with it. He saw a girl who nonetheless achieved always, was top of her class at all the schools she attended, got scholarships to a fancy boarding school and university, and was always responsible. This is why she was never happy, but everyone thought she was doing just great. Walter knew better. You would sit with Walter for hours, as you had with your grandmother, Janie, when you were 16 years old, and you spent her last summer together at a family cottage in Maine, sharing a gentleness she had never allowed herself with you, and many silences. She was trying to finish a book before she died, and your memory of someone regretting time not spent with their creative self before dying too young seared into your consciousness like a warning. You were not with Janie when she died, but you had a fever and had written a poem you did not understand in some kind of automatic handwriting. Only when your mother called your boarding school and tracked you down at the Emily Dickinson retreat in Amherst, where you and some of your classmates were staying with your happily free-spirited 11th grade English teacher with long, wild white hair and a young lover, did you realize that you had written that poem the moment Janie had died. You had felt her soul enter you, an urgency not only to write the poem, but also for your own life that would manifest in the coming years as reckless desire, creative work, and a lot of traveling that did not look like the more orderly path you had originally paved for your frightened younger self, but that you would never regret because you allowed yourself, for the first time ever, to be irresponsible, even if in a messy way. Walter, too, when he was diagnosed, had been in the middle of a memoir he had wanted to write for years, but put off because he was an academic and had written only academic books. So he had wanted to write this book about his own family. His parents had just died and he had an inheritance and was beginning to buy a few things for his apartment and was planning on finishing the book. Then bam, the cancer. He too tended to drink a lot, as did Janie, as did your mother, as did you for a time, which is, you know, the way most people mostly indulge in being irresponsible when they can't do the thing they really want to do, or because they drink, they don't do the thing they really want. But no matter, irresponsibility will have its way with you one way or the other. You must allow it in a conscious way, or you will pay. And Walter was paying, and dearly. And once again, you were watching someone die too young who had wanted to produce a creative work and had not. And sitting next to him gave you time to look outside his 14th floor apartment and notice the fine light of September sky in the village in New York City, a kind of light that can only be experienced. This was before 9/11, so that blue sky with the lovely breeze that gently blows away August's brooding heat was only a good thing, and did not come with a disconsonant sense of foreboding in 1998. Walter said to you one day, when he could still sit up, that if his partner died before him, he had left you all his money in his will, and to please use it on traveling the world and not on those, quote, silly theater things, which in any other circumstance would have seemed insulting, but was not then, because you and he were in the irresponsibility bubble, and you had disbanded the company anyway. And none of this makes sense as you write it, but it all makes sense as you feel it. Walter was one of the only people left on the planet who was allowed to call you Julie. He had known you since you were 6. He knew it was a miracle you were alive, though most people would not have a clue about that because you still had not stopped the dancing seal act, could not. He wanted you to have freedom, to be irresponsible, to just go and see the world. Well, he died soon after, and you never did receive that material inheritance. You did receive his spiritual bequest to you, even so. The night Walter died, you were at a theater because a friend was in a play. You hated the play and wanted to leave during intermission, but you did not because you were being responsible and didn't want to hurt her feelings. So because of that, when you got back home, you hear a message on your answering machine that Walter is dying, and you call the hospital and find out that he has already died. The earth falls out underneath your feet. You're standing in your apartment on the floor, but feel vertigo. You cannot breathe. Your then husband, who is generally difficult about most things, turns out to be incredibly good about holding you so you don't fall over now. You are sobbing and yelling at the same time, saying over and over again, I fucking hated that show. If I'd left the show, I could have seen Walter before he died. You could not let that go. You felt cold, were shaking. It was October, but not that cold. You made a solemn vow to yourself and the world, that you would never consciously waste anyone's time ever again, that you would always leave shows you hated, that you would follow your intuition and allow yourself to be irresponsible. But you didn't put it that way. All you said is, I will never waste anyone's time ever again. But you know now you meant being irresponsible, because only when irresponsible can you be present for what matters. Life and death has nothing to do with anyone's plans and schemes, paying the bills, updating social media, answering emails, doing the dishes, or worrying about pensions. Mortality could give a fuck. The last time you saw him, in October, a little chillier, but the orange, red, yellow leaves just beginning to fall from the trees, the New York mid-autumn side lighting, making each edge seem heartbreakingly beautiful. And you sat with him in his apartment for hours, looking out his window as he slept and woke and slept and woke. He said softly between consciousness and sleep, I don't want to leave you. You believed your own hype at the time, so did not understand what he meant. You felt you were doing just fine. No idea that even as imperfect as he was, Walter was the ground beneath your feet. And that when he died, you would feel adrift for many years, and to some degree still do, and that he knew that. After he died, you had strange visions of him coming out of his grave and kind of haunting you, like he wanted something from you. And to some degree he had when he was at his worst and drunk, but he had not shown that side to you in many years. After you had stopped drinking and confronted him with the words he had said to you in blackout, he had been horrified and made sure when he saw you from then on to be sober. And so he was not grasping that day when he said he didn't want to leave you. You know this now, so many years later. He meant he knew you needed a witness, and when he died, the one person who is present over the years, but that had not left you alone in scary places and expected you to survive, but knew that had happened. The one person who had asked time and again of your parents, but what about Julie? The one person who could tell you, no, you are not crazy. You're doing the hardest thing of all when you're trying to write your first book or create your own work, would go with him, because he did support you as an artist and a writer. He just didn't like you to see you be responsible for everyone else. Like when you were running a theater company or trapped in a bad marriage because you thought you weren't allowed to leave. He knew you needed a break. He also knew you needed a witness. Only now, 20 years later, on an island where the Atlantic and North Sea meet, and the land and water and wind and sky itself is a kind of witness, offering you space to allow yourself. Can you accept the gift of his mortality, what he wanted you to have that he could not give himself because of his own burdens, the permission to indulge in exquisite irresponsibility? Thank you. So, thanks for
That was
asking me.
wonderful, Julia. How do you feel after reading that?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, this is the very first time I've read it without crying, and I think it's just because now I've read it a few times.
Yeah.
But just remembering him, and I wrote this as I did much of the book before I knew I was autistic as well. So it's just very interesting to see the way I was framing things and how right on I was, and also it's just interesting. So I'm noticing that as well when I'm reading. But yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I mean, I still believe what I wrote there. I really do think that that responsibility, in big air quotes, can be a real inhibitor.
Yeah, and it's a mask, isn't it, sometimes for sort of hiding what we're really feeling, or being able to indulge in our emotions, which can feel, like we're just, it's a real indulgence sometimes. But did you find that writing it was cathartic, or did you feel that it kind of allowed you to grieve
It's such
more
an
than had you just had those thoughts in your head, like writing it down? What was the experience?
It's funny because there's different kinds of writing, right? There's journaling and stuff, which is very therapeutic and very much about that. And of course, this was to a certain degree, but because I'm writing with the idea of communicating as well to other people, it's a mix. Like there, yes, of course. I mean, to some degree, sure, it's therapeutic, but that's not why I'm writing it. I'm writing it because what made me write it was not remembering Walter and how much he meant to me. It was, oh, it's irresponsibility. That's what it is. It was just weird. It was like when that came to me as a thought, that
Yeah.
was the frame, and then I realized it related to him, and for I had to distill this. I brought in everything in the kitchen sink into this essay, and it got distilled, because that's what I do, and so and then I thought about the thing about creativity and my grandmother and him and just the ways, and also alcoholism, which was, something I've been sober for a long time, but I definitely had that moment, as did many people in my family. That's a family thing. But like, uh that was a way of being irresponsible, that also that framed that too. It's like, well, that's what that was. It was just like I couldn't take it anymore in my head. And in the masking, like you said, I mean, I think there's all kinds of masking that people do. There's neurotypical masking, but there's also autistic masking, right? Which is an intensity,
Yeah.
an intensifier, because the fear is of being seen to the degree that really bad things could happen. So that adds another layer that's not quite in there, but that is implied really when you think about it. So it's just very interesting. And so because I'm writing about that, as I'm reading this, just to be honest, I'm reading it and I'm thinking about what I'm writing. I'm reading it aloud to you guys and I'm like, oh, this is really sad. So I'm not having, when I very first read it aloud, the first couple times I just burst out crying, but like now
Yeah.
it's more of a thing. It's more of an object. But hopefully it resonates for other people, emotion.
Yeah, it certainly did for me, and in just remembering my own grandmother, and the vulnerability that you've expressed throughout that piece was very moving, and it probably made me feel closer to you because I felt like, well, you kind of get it, and
Yeah.
I've actually experienced something really similar, and I can feel your pain. Um, so I felt quite drawn to it, actually, and the insight that you talk about, this thing about the irresponsibility, the permission to be irresponsible, I feel like is almost bringing a little bit of closure to the story in some ways, and it to me it sounded a little bit like narrative therapy in a way, because you have this narrative about what does this all mean, and I think that meaning that you sort of end with can actually also be quite healing for you, in a way, and now that you've read it a few times and have sat with it a few times, I can see that you've kind of processed some of that emotion. Anyway, I don't want to turn this into a therapy session,
No, but I hear you. You're
that's sort
absolutely
of,
right. No, you're absolutely right, though. I mean, you're not wrong. I didn't think you were, but like, I just want to say like
yeah.
that resonates completely. And I was listening to you and thinking, yeah, that's interesting. And it's kind of like that, because weirdly enough, I think you'll probably understand this because you write as well. When you're writing, when you read it, you're suddenly a reader. You're a reader of your own writing, but you're reading, so it's kind of is bibliotherapy in its own weird way. It's like I'm kind of getting it as I'm reading it, if that makes any sense. And then
Yeah.
even when I read my own writing, I have the experience I have with a lot of other books of like, oh, that's what that meant. Like, and it's my
Yeah.
own writing, but I still have these moments of like, oh, look at that.
Well, I
Didn't
think
even realize that was there.
yeah. I mean, when you're rereading it, you're hearing yourself, you're being heard.
Yeah.
Even though it's you hearing yourself, that feeling of being heard, of feeling seen, of your emotions
Mm,
being seen, of that self-witness,
mm,
is actually quite powerful, you
mhm.
know?
It
You,
is. It really is. Yeah, no, and I think that's why it's great that you have the journaling component in the bibliotherapy too for people, or maybe people write poems or do other things, create things out of it too. But
yeah,
like, I think that's an important piece. And actually, vice versa, when I teach writing workshops, I tell people, I'm like, reading is writing, like the writing process includes your reading, whatever you're reading. It doesn't even have to be your own stuff, but like it's all part of that process because it's all this world of words. And I think that what's interesting about, if I dare to call what I wrote literature, is like it does something with words that potentially opens up something beyond words. I mean, that's the goal of my words, is to get beyond words, if that makes sense. And you know and I think that's what most really good literature does. That's why I'm like, okay, do
Yeah,
I do
it,
that?
it,
Well, that's what I'm
it
trying to do anyway.
no, absolutely. I mean, it brings forward story and meaning and symbolism, which is the language of the unconscious, and that is where all the work starts to happen. And this is why children are more engaged when you tell them a story, and all of a sudden things start to make sense for them, and they can express their emotions, which they don't have a lot of emotional language, but they have the language of story, which is how they can process their own emotions. So I think that that's what you're doing, especially when you're writing things in a narrative format. You're really bringing those elements of storytelling in.
Yeah.
It's quite
It's really interesting because I lead writing workshops, and a couple different people, not just one now, are actually kind of writing almost adult fairy tales. Like they're kind of bringing that world into it. It's so like what you're saying. That's why I just thought of it, because of the resonance of like the symbolism and the playfulness. Like I think especially when you're an adult, it's very easy to get like, we're very serious, we're adults. And like when you allow yourself that kind of playfulness, a lot of stuff can pop through, right? That might not be, you're guarding the borders and don't want anything to come in. And then it's like, oh, like you said, blocking things. And also as somebody who's, I've got a whole thing in trauma, and I do trauma informed yoga. And so I also know some things are blocked for good reason, and they can come out, you got to titrate how that comes out. Like, and I think literature is a really interesting way to do that, because it's not like hammering at somebody's defenses. So I think like if somebody sees something, they're ready to see it, right? Like, as opposed to, you know what I'm talking about. You're a therapist.
Well, literature is actually relaxing the defenses so that you can come forward with your true feelings and be vulnerable. And that's what literature is doing. It's relaxing your defenses. It's letting you feel safe on the page. So you're spot on from that perspective. And that those fairy tales of the adult fairy tales are actually where a lot of you're processing things with writing those fairy tales, and you're bringing forth that it's very similar to dream work in a way. When you work with dreams and trying to make meanings of dreams, you're making meanings of those fairy tales. A lot to do with the unconscious, let's say. But yeah, thank you for reading that. That was very, very it was lovely to hear you read it.
And I really appreciate it a lot. I mean, I appreciate the question. I also just wanted to say, because I put it in the chat for anyone who wasn't here earlier, Bijal's information, where you can find her website and her email and her Instagram and Facebook, I think. Yeah. So they're there if you want to know more, which I hope you all do. And you'll find out when her book, we're not ending right this second. I just wanted to do that before I forgot.
I wanted to share. The book is actually only available in the UK next year. Well, next November, I think it'll be available in the US. But there's an ebook that might be available on the 15th of February, which is when it comes out in the UK. So the ebook will be available worldwide. But if you want the paperback or the hardback, in the US, it comes out in November next year. But in the UK, it's in February.
But I know secret, which is you can order it from Amazon. If you're willing to pay extra shipping, you can get it. I've gotten so many British books that way before they come out in the US.
Oh
So
yes, yeah.
it's possible. So
There is
if you're
that
just
option.
like,
Yeah.
I want to avoid this, you can. Dun dun dun. And the miracle of the horror that is Amazon. And I think you can pre-order it
Yeah.
too, which helps a lot. Yeah. So
Yeah, and
and
I've got tons of free reading lists and book prescriptions, like Julia mentioned on the
on
website. If
yeah,
you
the
want like
website's
reading,
amazing. Yeah,
some reading
sorry.
inspiration. So
Yeah,
Julia's one sits under bereavement, but this A to
there's a
Z of
lot.
reading lists again for adults and children. I'll just put the link in the chat, but
Mm,
that gives you an idea of some of the book recommendations for different mental health themes, which might be helpful. And there's lots of free resources online as well. So feel free to like browse on bibliotherapy if you're interested in. It's very much a subset of art therapy. So and works in similar ways. So yeah.
And do you have, before we're going to go to Q&A in a few minutes, but is there anything like just any kind of wrapping up thoughts you have of the things you want to make sure you touch on, either about your work or my work or both of our works and how they relate, or either one?
No, all I can say is leverage your reading, leverage it. Don't just read. I think you can get a lot out of your reading, so leverage it as much as you can. And hopefully there's some tools that I've shared today which might help be helpful. I don't know, but I think that's really important. It'll change the way you look at the world and you look at yourself and the awareness that you gain. Yeah,
it's kind of like it feels like it's almost like what you do anyway as a reader, but then just amplifying it that way, or leveraging. Said as a banker, that was a good banker move there.
you only get one life, right? You gotta
Right. No, I just think it's funny because I still love that. I love the fact that you started there. I just think it's fantastic. It's just there are many parts of your story I adore, but that's definitely one of them. So I just want to say, does anyone have a question? If you'd like to ask it in person as opposed to the chat, you can just put a little. If you go to reactions, you can raise your hand, I believe, and I can pick you and let you unmute if you'd like to have a question for Bijal or both of us or either of us. Or you can write it in the chat if you're feeling shy. Robin, okay, let me allow you. Hold on. Okay, there. You should be able to unmute yourself, I think.
Okay.
There
Okay.
you go.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I have so many. This has been fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. I'm so excited. The idea of bibliotherapy, which of course I'd never thought about. And then I realized that I do it in other context, in the sense of I'm involved with two groups that we meet on Zoom occasionally together, but mostly on Zoom. And we read a passage from a book that we're all reading, and we read it out loud, several paragraphs, and then we talk about it. Sometimes we talk about the actual passage, but often it invokes things that people talk about, how they're trying to apply this or not, or how it's not well applying it, or whatever, about whatever the issue is that came up, which is, I think, would be the same as the bibliotherapy. This is not fiction, it's nonfiction. So I just am so excited, and I can't wait to read your book. But I did want to ask, when you made a very interesting point at the top, and then I'm going to get off of here because there are other people, but you made a point at the beginning of how when you read something, it almost can feel as though the person is going through it. The brain can't completely make the difference. Is that true with fiction and nonfiction? I tend to read more nonfiction, or I'll read historical fiction. Right now, for example, I'm reading the book that Julia's reading on unmasking unmasking. Oh, Christ.
Autistic unmasking.
Huh?
Autistic unmasking, is it?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sounds like, okay. And so my question is there a difference in terms of how the brain deals with it, both with nonfiction or fiction? And kind of complementary to that is, how is reading online different than reading paper?
Two very good questions, and I do talk about that about both of those actually in the book, but it depends what the nonfiction is. So if it's memoir mimics novel a lot because there's a narrative, there's a lot of storytelling elements, and I think the common denominator is the storytelling, because that's the bit that we're going to connect with, where we're gonna find resonance, and they follow similar brain pathways. So it can work with some memoirs, narrative essays. It wouldn't if you were reading a report, it wouldn't work, but because reports are very factual. But if you're reading memoir essays, it certainly would. And in terms of your second question about paper versus reading online, there's something about the sense of touch that makes us feel connected to the book more than when we're reading online. And I think that's where the therapeutic work might be more effective. But having said that, I read a lot on Kindle and digital versions, and it's when I'm writing things down and journaling and reading back on my own notes on paper, where I'm processing things. So it doesn't really make that much of a difference, but there is something about the paperback, the sense of touch that's also involved, that makes us feel more connected, that has more meaning for us. And so we can't forget that aspect of why paperbacks and hardbacks can actually be real conduits for healing and therapy.
I'm wondering too if there's also that research about how when students actually handwrite notes in class, they helps them retain things better than even if they're typing on a laptop and stuff. So I'm wondering too if that relates. There's something about ye olde analog-y world that a lot of us are old enough to remember, that there's something there that it's the hand connection that's like you're saying. To me, that's why I have all these books. People are like, why don't you digitize? Why don't you get rid of your books? I'm like, these books are my whole life. I mean, this is there's more books here that you can't even see, but this is my autobiography, in a sense, or all of my books. And wild dogs aren't going to make me get rid of them, and in the hard copies, and it's a pain in the butt to have them. They've made 2 transcontinental moves. They moved with me to London, they moved with me back from London, and they've added on, and I just feel like there's something
it's an attachment, isn't it?
It is, but I feel like there's a real thing to it too. I mean, yes, you could look at it however you want, but I feel like there is something. And I also have all my old notes and my old notebooks and my old journals, my old handwritten journals. And again, people are really fond of digitizing all this stuff. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but there's something about the paper, the smell, the falling apartness of it, the weird binders, that it's a tangible, tactile, because again, that goes to the the less conscious, the senses. It gets right into the body sense of things, right? And I feel like there's a whole thing that goes on there.
Yeah, definitely. There's a connection. Oh, what happened?
You're here. We can
hear you. Sorry, I think something popped up on my screen. No, there's a connection, right? There's this. It's all these elements of connection that we feel, and for me, the premise of any therapy is the connection. Whether that's with a therapist or whether that's with ourselves, and also the meaning that these things draw for us, because remember, language is all about meaning, and the meaning that we draw from our our notes and the book that we have on that side, that particular shelf, and
Right.
the way we've arranged it, all of those things are interplaying. So yeah, that definitely onto something there, I'd say. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I'll bet that's why the journaling helps so much too. So Robin, did you have any follow-up questions? Does anyone else have a question? Again, you can either raise your physical hand. If I don't see you, you can put something in the chat because there's more of you than I can see. So
No, and there's lots of questions in the chat, so I will turn it over, other than just say thank you, thank you, thank you. As a person who's participated in been an important aspect of Julia's life.
The most important aspect of Julia's life. Julia wouldn't have a life if it weren't for you.
Every time I read or hear her read these different portions, I come up with a whole sense of new meanings and new reactions. And I appreciated the fact that you mentioned that Julia mentioned that reading it over and over as opposed to writing it each time is like a new experience. Or maybe it's become more like an object for you, Julia, but for me, it's like, it's just very, very powerful. Anyway, I'm off. Somebody else.
Okay.
Go on all day. We're not going to.
Anyone else want to either write a question in the comments or have something they'd like to add? Or an observation is okay too. It's a shy group today. I just need to, Laura, okay. All right, Laura, you should be able to unmute now.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
good.
I actually want to
Excellent.
respond to what Robin said. Jews read the entire 5 books of Moses every year. And we say, it's like every week, the whole world reads the same section. And we say the text is the same, but you're different. So, every time Robin hears those same words, it means something else.
Yeah, and it's true. Every time you read the same piece of text, you gain new insights. It's always like that. You'll always the more familiar you become with something, the more you'll see in something that you hadn't seen before. And so I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that. That's definitely happened to me on multiple occasions. And that's a part of of the world. Like, how well do we know the world? We don't. There's so much there that we've missed, and I think that's the same with reading. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I reread certain things I love. Over the Doris Lessing book, The Golden Notebook I mentioned, I read that. I don't remember, I lost track of how many times I read that, and I don't do that with many things. I'm not somebody who reread, but things that matter a lot. I'm also in 12-step fellowships as well. And so there's a certain kind of literature you end up reading over and over again. And that's hilarious because I'm like, when did they put that in? I've been like sober for 36 and a half years. And I'm like, I don't remember that part, and it's incredible, like how all these kind of things are just in this world, and different things you read, or things I've written. Like, I also have stuff I've written. It's the same thing. Like, anybody who's a writer is going to understand. It's like, so you write something and, first you reread it the next day, and you're like, this is shite, and then the next day you like it, and the next day it's kind of like, well, it's half shit and it's half okay. And, it's like, and there's just all these, so there's that judgment. But then if it's really old and it comes back from a long time ago, it's like, I wrote that, like because I'm doing this memoir. It was so interesting. I'll go back into like my journals from when I was like 12 or something, and I'm like, what? I was thinking about that. And I literally still have those things. And so it's just like that's kind of amazing to see certain things and realize like there's some sort of strange little tropes I've had throughout my life, and like really far back, and that's kind of amazing. Like, I have a whole diatribe against ageism when I was 13. Like, it's just like, really? like I have diatribes against ageism now, but I started early, it's just really funny, right? To see that kind of thing. Hilarious. I'm gonna check the chat to see if there's any questions. There's lots of thanks. Okay, so Audrey asks about a list of, I'm just going to read her chat if that's okay, Audrey. This has been the most enlightening, astonishing time. Like for Robin, sparks have been set off on my mind. Today I was called to give some thought to a young alcoholic cousin. I'd love a list of books he could read. And do you mean more like sort of fiction, nonfiction, like kind of not so much like this is a recovery book, but more something that they could relate to, sort of thing?
Yeah, that would be helpful to know whether you're looking for something sort of within fiction, nonfiction. I assume it's to do with addiction.
Because there are a lot of memoirs, there's a lot of interesting fiction, there's a lot of different kinds of things, but it'd be nice to know what, or maybe you're looking for any of the above, which is fine. You don't have to know, but just wondering.
Yeah, I've got a reading list on my website on treating addiction, which I can share with you.
Yeah.
And there'll be more.
In.
There'll be more in the book as well, but let me show you the one on my website.
And there's also, as she's going to show you, from my knowledge, Audrey, there's also a lot of really interesting memoirs now that are not the kind of usual one, like The Recovering from Leslie Jameson. I don't know if you've got that in yours, Bijal, but I'll put it. That are more, like, in other words, if that person is literary, they might like that because it's about her, she's considered very cool and hip and now, and she got sober, so it's like that kind of thing where, or Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. And he's somebody who got sober, who just like really very interesting kind of, that's more of a literary take on it. Looking at things, or even weirdly enough, I don't know if you would agree with this one, Bijal, but I think, I was definitely drinking a lot, but one of the things that kept me off any hard drugs was reading Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. I read that book and I was like, I'm never going to do heroin ever. Like, and it's like the best anti-drug book ever. It's a weird thing to say. I don't know. I guess some people could read it and think this looks great, but I read it and I was like, oh my God. And because it's Burroughs, the guy's not telling you not to do drugs. You know what I mean? Like I don't even know if he meant to do that, but that was my take on it. And I think he saved me from going anywhere really seriously bad. You never know who you're gonna, who's gonna save you. You're like, William Burroughs, you saved me. That's
really interesting. I've written that one down actually. I'm gonna go and check it now.
Oh yeah, it's pretty intense, just so you know. You're gonna be like, why did she tell me to read this? But it's such a horror story about addiction. In a sense, and it's all surreal, crazy imagery, and he did a lot of cut-ups with it and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, to me, it was the takeaway was like, never do that.
And I think addiction, the underlying emotion often is shame. So when I suggest books, I also look at themes of shame, because it's really addressing that. But I think in the reading list, there's some suggestions for that as well. Just looking at it, and I have another one for shame as well, I think, which I can share it as well. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff on the website that would be helpful, and if it's not on there, let me know and I'll put a list on. Here we go. Shame and guilt. But the 12-step recovery program is brilliant, especially the AA's methodology. fantastic.
It's very similar to what you're saying in that either you're reading stories, like the big book has a lot of stories of people who got
Yeah.
sober, and they've changed it over the years to make more modern stories, and people in the meetings tell their story. It's like an endless
Yeah.
narrative
The group,
medicine,
yeah, the
and
group
people,
elements, yeah.
yeah, and you hear, there's this thing that they say that, you end up hearing your story, your full story eventually, and that can happen.
It's a mirror, isn't
Oh
it? You
God,
need to see yourself in that mirror.
I just thought
Um,
of another book for you, Audrey, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. If he's a real,
yes, yeah, yes.
literary person,
Yeah.
it's brilliant. It's another,
Yeah.
and it's the most brilliant take on AA and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's
Yeah.
no holds barred. It's an amazing analogy to addiction and our culture and capitalism, but also just it's a love letter to crazy AA. Like, it's not about like, hey, it's great and here's a tip. It's just it's beautiful. so if he's literary, that's another place to go.
Yeah.
And it's
And he's amazing. I mean, he's an amazing writer, and
incredible. Like, there's nothing. I'm
real gift with words.
And there's somebody who I think, this is completely off topic, because I think one of the reasons that antidepressants started working for him and he killed himself is I think he was undiagnosed autistic as well, to be honest. I'm claiming him for my club. But it was before people knew that manifestation, and he died. It's just tragic, because I'd give anything for him to be alive and writing right now. Like, anyway, just breaks my heart. But yeah. So yeah, there's lots of different things. And look at Bijal's list. And I've got to say this about your list too. Like, it's not just modern stuff. Like, she's got stuff from the Wayback Machine too, which is great. So, you've got Montaigne, you've got, the Brontes, you've got whatever. I just remember, I think, and I don't know if you have this, but if I had one under family, I'd definitely put Brothers Karamazov up.
Yeah, no, I mean, often I curate prescriptions
families
that are not necessarily therapeutic, for personal interest, and I get the most randomest of requests. Like, I don't know, I want space fiction, but I'm feeling, depressed, or and we do the research for what would be appropriate.
And there are things like, that's what I've loved about reading people in my groups that write, really speculative stuff. It's incredible how deep that can go, and how much can happen in those kind of, things in quote genre fiction. Amazing stuff can be done. If I could do that, man, I wish I could pull that off, because I think that's just brilliant that people, the ability to,
well, fiction is, is the license to tell the truth in an unlimited, unrestricted way.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Because nobody can sue you. So it's fiction. I swear. Well, listen, it's almost time. Does anyone have a final question, or Bijal, do you have a final, or it doesn't have to be final thought, but I mean, last final sounds so funny.
No, and that, I just want to thank everyone for spending this hour with us, and your interesting questions and insights. And all I'd say is go and explore bibliotherapy and see what you can do with it.
I'm so excited, Bijal, and I'm just thrilled. It just got to say, this is just a personal note of seeing something go from book proposal to book coming out and everything, and then to have had, and then she was so generous with her little blurb on my book and everything. It's just like, it's cool. Like, writing is both isolating, but then you also meet I think, you meet these amazing people along the way, and Bijal is definitely one of them. So.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have met you, Julia. Honestly, you have a gift with words, and it's been so nice to hear some of your writing, read it, and I missed our little proposal class at the crazy LA hours.
Yes, we'll have to figure out something. We've got to have a reunion of the nutty people there. Yeah, it was great. So, but Anyway, all right, so I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you all for watching, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can get in touch with us. I'll put the contact for both Bijal and me in the description, so you can find us. Thanks.